Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's jump into the story. Today's tale is about a poor student who marries a 71-year-old wealthy woman. 7 days later, he is shocked by what he discovers. But first, let's turn our attention back to our main character. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark faces his decision, and the consequences that follow. Mark spent the following days weighing his decision. The promise of financial security, of having his debts erased, was so tempting. He couldn't deny that. But something inside him hesitated, unsure of how to navigate this strange, unorthodox arrangement. The idea of marrying someone he didn't love, especially a woman much older than him, felt foreign. Yet the weight of his situation, the pressure mounting on his shoulders, pushed him towards that desperate choice. He couldn't help but imagine the relief he would feel if he agreed to this contract. No more struggling to pay rent. No more missing meals just to save up for books. And his mother's medical bill she couldn't bear seeing her suffer. This opportunity would change everything for them, wouldn't it? But there was something nagging at him. Would it be worth it? Would he lose something more important in the process? On the evening he was supposed to give Eleanor his answer, Mark stood outside the bistro where they had met. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and glistening under the streetlights. He stared at the reflection of his own tired face in the glass doors of the cafe. Could he really go through with this? Was he willing to sacrifice his integrity for the sake of comfort? He entered the bistro and walked to the table where Eleanor sat, as poised and calm as ever. She looked up as he approached, her sharp blue eyes scanning him with the same unwavering composure as before. She had a quiet power about her, something that commanded respect without needing to be said. "Mr. Davis, I'm glad you came," she said, offering him a polite smile. "I assume you've made your decision." Mark sat down across from her, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The air between them felt thick with expectation. "I've thought about your offer," Mark began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "And I've decided to accept." Eleanor's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes softened, as though she'd expected this, but was still relieved. She nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a neatly folded contract. "Here it is," she said, sliding the document across the table to him. "Everything is outlined clearly. You will live with me, accompany me to public events, and fulfill the duties of a husband as needed. But in private, this is simply an arrangement. There will be no romantic obligations." Mark glanced at the contract. The terms were simple and clear: no intimacy, no expectations beyond the public image of a married couple. It sounded like a fair trade. But could he really live with this, knowing that it was all for show? The lines between business and personal began to blur in his mind. "Once you sign, I will take care of everything," Eleanor added. "Your debts will be cleared, and you'll have financial freedom. In return, all I ask is your commitment to this arrangement." Mark's eyes lingered on the contract for a moment longer before he took the pen in his hand. He wasn't just signing a piece of paper. He was signing away a part of himself, the part that believed in love, the part that had hoped for something more. But in that moment, it seemed like the only way forward. He signed his name at the bottom. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, her voice holding a hint of warmth that surprised him. "This will be the start of a new chapter for both of us." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of finality wash over him. There was no going back now. He had made his choice. As he stood up to leave, Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I know this isn't easy," she said. "But I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand why this arrangement is better than anything else." Her words were calm, almost reassuring. Mark wasn't sure whether it was the promise of a future free from worry or the way Eleanor spoke with such confidence, but he found himself nodding in agreement. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The next few days were a whirlwind of changes. Mark moved into Eleanor's mansion, a sprawling estate that felt like something out of a dream. The rooms were vast and opulent, with tall windows overlooking perfectly manicured gardens. Every corner of the house seemed to exude wealth and privilege, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment he'd left behind. But despite the luxuries surrounding him, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. He wasn't used to this world, and it felt like every day was a reminder of how different he was. But Eleanor didn't treat him like an outsider. She spoke to him with respect, as if he were an equal. She involved him in her day-to-day activities, introducing him to the people in her life as her husband, always with that same calm composure. Over time, Mark began to settle into the rhythm of this new life. He attended high-profile events with Eleanor, always at her side, playing the role of the perfect husband. On the outside, it looked like they were a couple in love. But on the inside, Mark was still unsure of where he stood. Was this truly just a business arrangement, or was there something deeper forming between them? As he spent more time with Eleanor, he started to see a different side of Hera's side that wasn't just about wealth and power. She had a kindness in her that few people saw, and slowly, he began to wonder if he had made the right choice. Maybe this marriage wasn't as fake as it seemed. But the real question was, could he let go of his doubts and allow himself to feel something real for Eleanor? Or would he remain trapped in a contract that was supposed to be nothing more than business? Only time would tell. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark begins to face his feelings and the true nature of his relationship with Eleanor comes to light. Mark sat at the grand dining table, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his wine glass. The mansion was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant footsteps of the house staff going about their duties. Eleanor had already finished dinner, but Mark had a lot on his mind. Despite the luxuries surrounding him, he still couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in his own life. The days seemed to blend together, each one feeling more like the last. He was living in a world that was far removed from everything he had known, where wealth was abundant and expectations were high. He glanced across the table at Eleanor, who was quietly sipping her tea, her posture perfect, her eyes never straying from the book she was reading. There was something calming about her presence, yet something unsettling at the same time. Mark had long stopped thinking about the contract, the reason they were here, but now, in this moment, as they shared a quiet evening, the reality of their situation hit him. He had agreed to marry her for financial security, but was that really all it was? It was strange. Over the past few weeks, he'd started to notice things about Eleanor that went beyond the surface. She had a soft side, a vulnerability that she rarely showed anyone. She'd speak about her late husband in private moments, a sadness creeping into her voice when she did. She had no children, no family left to carry on her legacy, but in him, she found someone she could trust. Mark had always been an independent person, never relying on anyone else, but now, in Eleanor's presence, he found himself feeling something new, sense of responsibility. Mark stood up, excusing himself from the table, his mind racing. He needed space to think, to figure out where this was all going. He walked to the grand piano in the corner of the room, his fingers brushing over the keys. Music had always been his escape, a way to quiet his racing thoughts. He sat down and began playing softly, the familiar melody of Beethoven filling the empty room. As the music played, Mark felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was the first time in weeks that he felt connected to something real. He had been so focused on surviving, on getting by, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel anything for Eleanor beyond the agreement they had made. But as the music played, something shifted inside him. Was it possible that he was beginning to see her as more than just a business partner? Was it possible that this marriage, born out of necessity, could turn into something more? He was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He turned to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She watched him for a moment, her eyes studying him with an intensity that Mark couldn't quite place. "You play beautifully," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Mark smiled faintly, surprised by her praise. Thank you, he replied. I haven't played in a long time. Eleanor stepped into the room, walking towards him with the same composed grace she always had. She stopped beside him, looking down at the piano. It's good to see you enjoying something for yourself, she said, her tone softer than usual. You've been so focused on the contract, the arrangement, that I think you've forgotten who you are. Mark looked up at her, surprised by her insight. He hadn't expected her to notice. But maybe that's what made their arrangement so complicated. She wasn't just a wealthy woman in need of a husband. She was someone who had been through loss, someone who understood what it meant to feel lonely despite being surrounded by wealth. And now, he was starting to see her in a different light. I didn't realize how much I needed this, Mark admitted, his fingers lightly tapping the keys. I've been so caught up in everything that's wrong with my life that I forgot about what I love. Eleanor nodded, her gaze softening. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes, it's easy to forget the things that make us happy when we're consumed by the weight of the world. But it's important to remember who you are, Mark. She paused for a moment before adding, I may not have asked for love, but I never intended to make this a cold arrangement. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Mark saw something deeper there, something he hadn't expected to find. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air. Mark felt a shift in the atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been there before. Eleanor wasn't just a woman he had made a deal with anymore. She was someone who saw him not just as a husband for show, but as a person. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock on the doorframe. A staff member entered the room, informing them that an important guest had arrived and was waiting in the drawing room. I'll go see who it is, Eleanor said, breaking the moment. But as she turned to leave, Mark felt an overwhelming urge to stop her. Eleanor, he said, his voice slightly shakier than he intended. She paused and looked back at him, waiting for him to continue. Mark hesitated, unsure of what he wanted to say, but the words came out anyway. I don't know what this is, he admitted. This arrangement, it's not what I thought it would be. I came into this expecting one thing, but now I'm not sure anymore. I don't know if this is just about business anymore. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her eyes searching his face. For a brief moment, Mark saw vulnerability in her gaze, something that made him realize that perhaps she, too, was struggling with the same questions. Maybe they weren't so different after all. She smiled softly, her voice calm. Neither do I, Mark. But I'm willing to find out. Together. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark faces a turning point in his relationship with Eleanor and must make a decision that will change everything. Mark stood in the quiet room, staring at the space Eleanor had just left behind. Her words echoed in his mind, I'm willing to find out. Together. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The weight he had carried for so long, the uncertainty, the doubts, were starting to lift. Could it be possible? Could this arrangement, this marriage that started as a contract, turn into something more? He wasn't sure yet, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending to be indifferent. He needed to understand what was happening between them. The evening had started out just like any other. They had attended a charity gala together, their arms linked as they walked into the grand ballroom, surrounded by well-dressed guests and the glittering ambience of the night. Eleanor, as always, had commanded the attention of the room. Mark, however, felt like he was just playing a part standing next to her, smiling, nodding, and going through the motions. But as the night went on, something began to shift. Eleanor was more than just a business partner in that moment. She was a woman who had gone through loss, a woman who was standing beside him, not out of obligation, but out of some unspoken connection. She had never asked him for love, but she had given him something more, a sense of belonging. She had shown him kindness, understanding, and a patience that Mark had never experienced before. In the midst of the gala, Eleanor had taken a moment to introduce him to some of her business associates. Mark had gone through the usual pleasantries, shaking hands, nodding along as she spoke with her colleagues. It was only when they were briefly left alone in a quiet corner of the room that he found himself confronting the growing tension between them. I've been thinking about what you said, Mark began, his voice lower than usual. Eleanor turned to face him, her gaze steady, waiting for him to continue. You said you wanted to find out what this could be. Well, I want that too. I can't keep pretending that this is just a contract, Eleanor. I don't know what it is, but I don't want to hide from it anymore. I want to understand what's happening between us. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read him. She took a small step forward, her presence suddenly feeling more real, more grounded than it had before. Mark, she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. I never expected this to be easy. I never expected it to be anything other than what it was supposed to be, a business arrangement. But that doesn't mean I haven't thought about what could happen between us. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time since he had agreed to the arrangement, Mark felt a flicker of hope. It was as if the walls they had both built around themselves were beginning to come down. I think I'm starting to see that, Mark replied. I don't know what this will turn into, but I don't want to shut myself off from it anymore. I can't keep living like I'm only here for the money or the security. I want more than that. And I think you do too. Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening. I do, she said, her voice almost a whisper. But we have to take this one step at a time. We both need to figure out who we are in this without all the expectations and pressure. I think we've both been living under the weight of everything else, and now, we need to focus on what we need, what we want, without the noise of the world around us. Mark nodded slowly, feeling a sense of understanding wash over him. He had spent so much time feeling trapped by the weight of his responsibilities, by the expectations of others. But now, with Eleanor, he felt like he had permission to explore something more, something real. He wasn't sure what it would look like, but he was ready to try. The night continued on, the guests dancing and laughing around them, but for Mark and Eleanor, the world had shifted. They were no longer just a businessman and his contract wife. They were two people, connected by something deeper than either of them had anticipated. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor turned to him with a smile that was both knowing and warm. Let's take a break from all of this, she said, gesturing to the crowd around them. Let's go somewhere quiet. I think we both need some time to think, to figure this out. She gently took his hand, guiding him out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. As they stepped outside, the city lights twinkled in the distance, and the quiet of the night wrapped around them. It was a strange feeling being alone with her, yet feeling more connected than he had in weeks. The questions about their future were still there, lingering in his mind, but for the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't facing them alone. They found a quiet bench in a secluded garden, away from the bustle of the gala. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand still holding his. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything in that moment. I don't know what this will turn into, Mark said, his voice steady, but I do know that I'm willing to find out with you. Eleanor looked at him, her smile growing wider. Me too, she said softly. And as the night stretched on, Mark realized that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to fall for Eleanor, in a way he never thought possible. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark and Eleanor face a challenge that will test their growing connection and their future together. The days following their conversation in the garden felt different for Mark. There was a subtle shift in the way he viewed Eleanor, and more importantly, in the way he viewed himself. He was no longer just the man trapped by his circumstance, she was someone beginning to find his place in the world again. He had taken a step toward letting go of his past and embracing the possibility of a future, but he still wasn't sure where that future would lead him. Over the next few weeks, their relationship continued to evolve, but slowly. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change, it was more like a slow, steady thaw. Eleanor wasn't rushing him, and neither was he rushing her. The time they spent together was no longer just about fulfilling a contract, it was about understanding each other, sharing moments that had nothing to do with the pretense of marriage. They would spend evenings talking about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Eleanor had been through more than most people could imagine, and Mark found himself respecting her in ways he never had before. One night, Eleanor invited Mark to join her at a private charity event she was hosting for the city's most influential figures. It was one of those glittering, high-class affairs where every conversation seemed to revolve around deals, money, and connections. The people around them were polite, but the air was thick with competition. Eleanor, as always, commanded the room with her elegance and confidence. But Mark wasn't focused on the guests or the event. His attention was on Eleanor. There was something about the way she moved through the crowd, the way she interacted with people, that made him admire her even more. As the night wore on, Mark found himself alone in a quiet corner of the venue, his thoughts drifting. The weight of his role as Eleanor's husband still felt heavy at times. He had never been one for pretending, and yet here he was, living in a world that felt so far removed from his own. But tonight, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt included. It was as though Eleanor had found a way to make him part of her world, without making him lose his sense of self. She had given him the freedom to exist alongside her, not just as a husband on paper, but as someone who was slowly finding his place in her life. He was startled from his thoughts by the sound of Eleanor's voice calling his name. She had a soft, inviting smile on her face as she approached him, a look of quiet concern in her eyes. "You've been quiet all night," she said, her tone gentle. "Are you okay?" Mark nodded, his smile reassuring. "Yeah, just thinking," he replied, his voice a little quieter than usual. "It's all still a bit overwhelming, you know?" Eleanor's gaze softened. She stepped closer to him, her hand lightly touching his arm in a gesture that felt intimate, but not forced. "I know this isn't easy for you, Mark," she said, her voice steady and sincere, "but I want you to know that you don't have to do this alone. Whatever this is between us, you're not doing it for me. You're doing it for yourself too." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what exactly he had been expecting to hear from her, but it certainly wasn't this. Eleanor had always been kind, but hearing her speak so honestly and directly touched something deep within him. She wasn't asking for anything in return. She wasn't expecting him to fit into some ideal role. She was simply offering him a chance to take his time, to figure things out for himself. It was a rare gift, one that few people would offer without expecting something in return. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his voice catching in his throat for a moment. "I needed to hear that." He hadn't realized how much he had been holding in until just now. Eleanor smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know," she said softly. "You don't have to rush, Mark. I'll be here. We'll figure this out together." That simple promise made Mark feel something shift inside him. He had always believed that he had to figure things out on his own, that asking for help or relying on someone else was a sign of weakness. But Eleanor was showing him that it wasn't weakness to rely on others, it was part of being human. And for the first time in a long time, Mark allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have it all, a life where he was loved, supported, and valued for who he was, not just for what he could offer. As the night came to a close and the guests began to depart, Mark found himself walking beside Eleanor, their hands brushing occasionally, as if testing the waters of a closeness that neither of them had expected to find. They didn't need to say anything more. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. Later that evening, when they were back at the mansion, Eleanor suggested they take a walk around the garden. The moonlight bathed the grounds in a soft glow, and the quiet serenity of the garden felt like a world away from the hustle and bustle of the charity event. As they walked in silence, Mark realized something profound. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He wasn't just playing a part in a contract. He was truly beginning to feel a connection with Eleanor. It wasn't love yet, but it was something close, and for the first time, he felt like he was where he was supposed to be. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark and Eleanor face an unexpected challenge that will test their growing bond and force them to confront their true feelings for each other. As the days passed, Mark began to settle into his new life with Eleanor. The initial tension between them had melted away, replaced by an unspoken understanding. He was no longer just playing the part of a husband for the sake of a contract, was beginning to truly feel a connection with Eleanor. They shared quiet moments together, and while they never openly discussed their growing bond, it was evident to both of them that something was shifting. One evening, after a long day spent attending business meetings with Eleanor, Mark found himself sitting alone in the library, reading a book by the fire. The warm glow of the flames flickered across the room, casting soft shadows on the shelves lined with books. He had been thinking a lot about his life lately, the path he had chosen, the choices he had made, and the unexpected turn it had taken when he agreed to marry Eleanor. He had never imagined that a simple business arrangement could change his life in such profound ways. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. She smiled softly when she saw him. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said, her voice warm but tentative. "I just wanted to check in. How are you feeling?" Mark looked up from the book, his gaze meeting hers. He noticed the subtle concern in her eyes and couldn't help but feel a warmth in his chest. It had been weeks since they had first entered this arrangement, and yet, in this moment, he realized just how much he had come to rely on her presence. "I'm okay," Mark replied, his voice calm. "Just thinking about everything. It feels strange, you know? All of this. But in a good way. I never expected it to feel this real." Eleanor stepped into the room and sat down beside him, her body language relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity to her presence. She turned her body slightly toward him, leaning in a little closer. "I know," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "This wasn't how I imagined things either. But we've both been through so much. I didn't expect to find someone I could trust in this arrangement. I didn't expect it to mean anything beyond the contract. But somewhere along the way, it became more." Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He had been trying to deny it, trying to convince himself that this was just a temporary arrangement, nothing more. But deep down, he knew that Eleanor was right. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. They were both navigating new emotional territory, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the feelings that were beginning to surface. He turned toward her, his gaze searching hers. There was an honesty in her eyes that made his breath catch in his throat. He had never expected to find this kind of vulnerability in someone like her. Eleanor had always been strong, poised, and controlled. But here, in this quiet moment, she was letting him see a side of her that was real, raw, unguarded. "I didn't expect any of this," Mark admitted, his voice low. "I didn't expect to feel like I could trust you. Like I could be myself with you. But the truth is, Eleanor, I'm starting to feel something I didn't think was possible." Eleanor's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but she paused, her eyes softening. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, and for a moment, they just sat there, in silence. It was as though the world outside the room didn't exist anymore. There was just the two of them, and a connection that was slowly becoming undeniable. "I feel it too," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I'm not asking for anything more than what we already have. But Mark, I think we both need to admit that something is changing between us. And it's okay to let it happen." Mark swallowed hard, his heart racing. He had been so focused on keeping his distance, on maintaining the boundaries of their arrangement. But now, with Eleanor's words, those boundaries felt like they were crumbling. "I'm not sure what this means," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I'm willing to find out. I think I'm falling for you, Eleanor." Her smile was gentle, yet there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, a mixture of surprise and something else, something tender. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said, her tone soothing. "We can take our time. But know this, Mark, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The uncertainty that had plagued him for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet certainty. He wasn't alone in this. Eleanor was right there beside him, and together, they would face whatever came next. As the night stretched on, Mark and Eleanor continued to talk, their conversation flowing more freely than ever before. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, neither of them felt the need to have everything figured out. They were simply two people learning, growing, and discovering what they could be together. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark and Eleanor face a challenge that will test their trust and commitment to one another, forcing them to decide whether they are ready to take the next step in their relationship. The days that followed Mark's admission of his feelings felt like a quiet shift in the air. The distance between him and Eleanor had closed, but there was a new tension that lingered, one that neither of them had expected. While they both acknowledged the unspoken bond that was growing between them, they hadn't yet figured out what it meant. Was it love? Was it simply companionship? Neither of them could answer that yet, but the more time they spent together, the more impossible it was to ignore the emotional connection that was deepening. It was a Saturday afternoon when the challenge finally arrived. Mark had spent the morning at his office, trying to catch up on work he had neglected. As much as he had started to feel at home in Eleanor's world, his old responsibilities were still there, quietly demanding attention. He was just about to leave when he received a call from Eleanor's lawyer. The tone of the conversation immediately set him on edge. "Mark, I need to speak with you," the lawyer said, her voice serious. "Eleanor is in a situation. We've received some news, and I think you need to be here." His stomach sank. Eleanor was always calm, always composed, but the urgency in her lawyer's voice left him feeling unsettled. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the mansion. When Mark arrived, the house was unusually quiet. The staff moved about the hallways in hushed tones, their faces solemn. Eleanor was in the study, sitting at her desk, her hands folded in front of her. She looked up as Mark entered, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He could see the strain on her face, the quiet tension in the way her shoulders were hunched. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice a mix of concern and confusion. Eleanor took a deep breath before speaking. "There's been a development," she said softly. "Some of my business dealings have come under scrutiny. A few people from my past are making claims, and they've started to spread rumors. It's affecting the company, and the media is picking up on it." Mark frowned, sitting down across from her. "What kind of rumors?" Eleanor looked at him, her gaze steady but tired. "They're questioning my integrity, Mark. There are accusations of misconduct. It's all lies, but the damage is done. I need to fix this, but the pressure is building. And I need your help." Mark's heart raced. He hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the possibility that Eleanor's life would suddenly spiral into chaos. But he could see the weight of the situation on her. She wasn't just asking for his support, she was depending on him. "What can I do?" Mark asked, his voice firm. Eleanor's eyes softened slightly as she reached for a folder on her desk and slid it across to him. "I need you to be with me, publicly. I need us to present a united front. The media and my business partners need to see that we're solid, that we're a team. If we stand together, the rumors will die down. If they see any sign of weakness, it will only get worse." Mark nodded slowly. He had known that being in this arrangement with Eleanor would come with challenges, but he hadn't imagined something like this. It was clear to him now that the stakes were higher than he had ever realized. "I'm with you," Mark said, his voice calm. "I'll do whatever it takes to help you through this." Eleanor's gaze softened, a mixture of relief and gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would do without you." They spent the next few hours strategizing, going over every detail of what they needed to do to clear her name and protect her reputation. As the sun set and the evening drew near, Mark realized just how deep his commitment to her had become. This was no longer about a contract. This was about standing by someone he had come to care for deeply, someone who had shown him that even in the midst of business deals and arrangements, real connections could still be forged. Later that night, they attended a press conference together, facing the media with the united front they had prepared. The questions were relentless, but Eleanor stood tall beside Mark, her hand subtly resting in his as they faced the cameras. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Mark had no idea where this was all heading, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer just fulfilling a role. He was in this, fully, and he was committed to standing by Eleanor, whatever came next. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark and Eleanor face even more challenges, and the true depth of their connection is put to the ultimate test. The days after the press conference felt like a blur for Mark and Eleanor. The media storm that had followed them seemed to calm, but the aftermath lingered. Despite the rumors being quelled, Eleanor's company was still dealing with the fallout. The strain was evident in her face, in the way she moved through the house, her posture slightly slouched, as though the weight of the world was still pressing down on her. Mark couldn't help but notice how much this had affected her. She was strong, but even the strongest of people needed support, and Mark knew that more than ever, he needed to be there for her. One evening, after another long day of meetings and negotiations, Mark found Eleanor sitting alone in the garden, her eyes staring off into the distance. The cool night air seemed to settle around them, and for the first time in days, everything felt still. Mark hesitated for a moment before approaching her, not wanting to intrude, but knowing he couldn't let her remain alone in her thoughts. "Hey," Mark said softly as he sat beside her. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression tired but grateful. She offered him a small smile. "I'm managing," she replied, her voice low. "But it's hard, Mark. I've spent so much of my life building something that matters, and now it feels like everything's slipping away. Sometimes, I wonder if it's all worth it." Mark watched her carefully, his heart aching for her. He had seen her so poised and in control in public, but now, in this quiet moment, he saw the vulnerability she kept hidden from the world. Eleanor had been through so much, losing loved ones, fighting for her place in a man's world, dealing with betrayal and loss, but she still stood strong, still kept going. Mark knew that what she needed most wasn't just his support, it was his belief in her. "You've built something incredible, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already achieved more than most people could ever dream of. And I believe in you. I always have." He paused, his gaze softening. "And I'm here with you. Every step of the way." Eleanor's eyes softened at his words, the weariness in her expression giving way to a quiet warmth. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, a small but significant gesture that spoke volumes. "Thank you, Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to find someone who truly believed and meant it because of my wealth or my status, but because of who I am. I've always had to fight alone. But with you, it feels like I don't have to anymore." Mark took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her fingers. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," he replied softly. "You have me, Eleanor. And I'm not going anywhere." There was a sincerity in his voice that even he hadn't realized was there until now. His feelings for her had grown beyond what he had ever anticipated. What had started as an arrangement, as a business contract, was now something deeper, something real. They sat there in silence for a while, their hands intertwined, as the world around them seemed to fade away. Mark realized that in the midst of all the challenges they had faced, something beautiful had emerged between them. It wasn't just about the marriage contract anymore. It wasn't about the business deal or the media pressure. It was about them, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, two people who had begun to build a life together, one moment at a time. As the night grew darker, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, "but I do know this: I want you by my side, Mark, whatever comes next." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through together. They were no longer just playing roles in a contract, they were partners, in every sense of the word. Mark squeezed her hand, his heart full. "I'm with you, Eleanor. I always will be." He wasn't just standing by her anymore, was truly standing for her. He had chosen her, and in that moment, he realized that he had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Stay tuned for the next part, where Mark and Eleanor face an unexpected turn of events that will test the strength of their bond and challenge the foundation they've built together. Mark and Eleanor stood together on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the city that stretched endlessly beneath them. The events of the past few months had tested them in ways neither of them had anticipated, but here they were, stronger for it. What had begun as a business arrangement, a contract born of necessity, had transformed into something deeper, something far more meaningful than either of them could have imagined. Mark had never believed in love at first sight, but standing here with Eleanor, he realized that it wasn't just love that had blossomed between them. It was trust, respect, and a quiet understanding that went beyond words. They had come a long way from the days when they first signed that contract. The challenges they had faced, Eleanor's business troubles, the media scandal, their own internal struggles had all brought them closer, had forced them to confront their feelings and fears. And now, they were standing at a crossroads, not as business partners, but as equals, both uncertain of the future but willing to face it together. Eleanor turned to him, her expression soft but determined. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, "I've spent so much of my life building walls around myself. I thought that if I kept everything controlled, if I never let anyone in, I'd be able to protect myself from the pain of loss. But you've shown me that there's strength in vulnerability, that love isn't a weakness, it's something that can make us stronger." She paused for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want to face it with you. Not because of the contract, not because of what we've been through, but because of what we are now, together." Mark's heart swelled with emotion as he listened to her words. He had never imagined that he would be here, standing by her side, in a place where love was no longer a foreign concept but something real. He had entered this marriage with doubts, with the belief that he could never truly love someone for the sake of a contract, but Eleanor had proven him wrong. She had opened his heart in ways he never thought possible, and in doing so, she had shown him what true partnership meant. He took a step closer to her, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Eleanor, when I first agreed to this arrangement, I was looking for a way out of my problems. I didn't expect to find someone who would change my life, someone who would make me feel like I was more than just my circumstances. You've given me something I didn't know I needed, a reason to believe in the future, a reason to believe in us. And I'm ready for whatever comes next. With you." Eleanor's eyes softened as she reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle against his skin. "I'm ready, too," she whispered. "We've been through so much, but I know we can face anything together. I don't need a perfect future, Mark. I just need you by my side." Mark smiled, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. It was true, life wasn't perfect. There would be challenges ahead, hurdles to overcome, but as long as they faced them together, nothing could break them. He had found not just a wife, but a partner, someone who was willing to stand with him even when the world seemed to be against them. They stood there for a moment longer, just holding each other, feeling the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. It wasn't just about the marriage contract, Anna Marie, it was about them, about their journey together. They were no longer just surviving, they were living. And whatever the future held, they would face it together. And so, Mark and Eleanor's story didn't end with a contract. It didn't end with a perfect resolution. It ended with a promise. A promise to love, to trust, and to stand by each other, no matter what. Stay tuned for the next chapter in their journey as they continue to face the unknown, knowing that the strength of their bond will guide them through whatever lies ahead.